The story of Angie Housman is one of unimaginable pain and tragedy. There were no witnesses to her abduction, and after 9 long days, the young girl was found, tied to a tree, and left for dead in the Missouri woods. In a gut-wrenchingly sad turn of events, Angie Housman had passed away just hours before a hunter found her, alone and freezing in the cold autumn woods. The following is a summary of the intense investigation for the missing child and a graphic description of what investigators found when Angie Housman's body was located. It's not appropriate for young or sensitive audiences. At times, it is a difficult story to hear, but there is a light at the end of this tunnel. Advancements in DNA technology paired with the tenacity, dedication, and patience of St. Louis investigators redeems this tale. A narrative that wades through pain and horror steps up in the end to deliver the answers her family sought for decades and reach a little bit of deserved justice. Angie Marie Housman, 9 years old, hopped down the large steps from her school bus on the chilly fall afternoon of November 18, 1993. Several other students had seen her on the bus and getting off of it at the bus stop on the corner of Wright Avenue and St. Gregory Lane, only about a half block from her parents' duplex in St. Anne, Missouri. St. Anne is a suburb of North St. Louis and near to the airport. Neighbors described it as a very safe neighborhood with kids all over. They would often see Angie riding her bike or playing outside. Classmates said Angie walked up the street alone, carrying her blue and white book bag. She never made it home, and no one saw what happened to her. Angie's mother, Diane, had been home napping with her little 2-year-old brother. Angie might have woken her up when she arrived after school, bounding through the door and tossing her backpack to the ground. But when that didn't happen, Diane slept on, and no one noticed Angie missing until her stepfather, Ron, arrived home from his job at Sears at 5 o'clock that evening. He found no sign of Angie or her backpack. It seemed that Angie had never made it to the house. Law enforcement was called in right away, and a police dog tracked Angie's scent from the bus stop along Wright Avenue. However, the dog lost the scent about halfway to her house. We don't know if the wind blew the scent away in that time or if she got into a car at that spot, St. Anne Police Sergeant Jim Mantle told a reporter. She couldn't just vanish. We don't know what happened. An attempted abduction had occurred on November 8th, just 10 days prior, in nearby Maryland Heights. A man had grabbed an 11-year-old of similar appearance to Angie after she got off her bus. The young victim managed to break free. She had described the kidnapper to authorities, and the composite sketch from her attempted abduction was distributed and used at the roadblocks set up near Angie's home. Right now, we're handling it as an abduction because of her age and the length of time she's been missing, said Sergeant Mantle about Angie's disappearance as he spoke to the media Friday, the day following her abduction. She's not the type who just takes off, he said of the little girl, who was a 4th grader at St. Anne's Bruder Elementary School. Angie was described as a friendly and cheerful child. She liked riding her bicycle, listening to rock and roll, and playing with her baby brother. I just hope to have her back as soon as possible so I can put my arms around her, Angie's mother, Diane Bone, said. Police used search crews and helicopters equipped with infrared sensors to look through local parks and creek banks for Angie. Area law enforcement teamed up to form a major case squad. It was comprised of a group of officers from various departments in the St. Louis area, all focused on locating Angie. This is not your run-of-the-mill missing persons case, Florissant Police Chief Robert Lowry said. It seems to me something dreadful has happened. Police Chief Lowry's son, Robert Lowry Jr., is acting deputy commissioner of the investigation. "Our main focus is getting Angie returned to her family," he said. A hotline for leads is created. Hundreds of law enforcement officers and volunteers participate in the search for Angie, but ultimately, she is found by someone who did not set out to look for her. 9 days after she was last seen, at 11 a.m. Saturday morning, November 27th, a deer hunter finds Angie Housman in the woods at a place known as the Bush Wildlife Area. Angie's partially nude body had been found 50 feet from the roadway, tied to a tree. Her head had been wrapped in duct tape, her entire face covered except for her nose. She had been handcuffed, beaten, and sexually assaulted. Pieces of her own underwear had been found in her mouth, used as a gag. Authorities believed that she had died from exposure mere hours before her discovery. By the time the hunter found Angie alone in the woods, snow had started to collect on her shoulders and in her hair. An autopsy would reveal that in the days leading up to her death, Angie had been held captive, tortured, and starved for days. Deep cuts to her wrists and thigh had been closed up with duct tape to slow the bleeding and extend the pain. Crime scene evidence further indicated that Angie was alive as she was bound and left in the woods, attorney Tim Lomar said. She struggled extensively to free herself before she ultimately perished. The depravity and violence of the acts caused pain and discomfort in seasoned detectives. Everyone wanted to catch the killer. Detective Sergeant Robert Lowry of the Major Case Squad described her murder as a very violent act. He told the Associated Press that they were following up on a number of potential suspects, but that there was no strong lead. "I'm very confident that we're headed in the right direction," Lowry said. The family and the community grieve, and a funeral is planned for the following Thursday. Then, just 4 days after Angie's body is located on Wednesday, December 1st, the St. Louis area experiences another horrifying abduction. 10-year-old Cassidy Senter disappears on her way to a friend's home after school in Bridgeton. They had planned to put up Christmas decorations. It is the third abduction or attempted abduction in less than a month. The community is terrified. Personal protection alarms have become popular among young women and girls in the St. Louis area. A father of one of Cassidy's classmates had given her one of these devices. They make a loud, piercing sound when a pin is pulled or a button pushed. At 3:30 that afternoon, a neighbor had heard a high-pitched squeal. Cassidy Senter had used her personal protection alarm. Alerted by the sound, the neighbor came quickly out to investigate, but found the device lying beside the road. There was no sign of Cassidy. Despite being equipped with a device meant to save her life, Cassidy Senter had still been abducted. Because of her alarm, police were quick to act. They set up roadblocks and distributed flyers with Cassidy's picture that evening. But search dogs and investigators were hampered by heavy fog and rain, and their searches turned up no clues. Police spokesman Jim Brady told reporters that there was no evidence to link the 3 abductions, but their similarities were something you can't ignore. Then, sadly, on December 9th, 8 days later, Cassidy's body was found under a white blanket in a vacant city lot. The news is devastating. Investigators work diligently to chase the leads coming in through the hotline, which are beginning to add up. The number of calls averaged more than 100 a day, keeping investigators busy. 2 weeks later, Gary Stufflebean of Houston, Texas, is charged with attempted kidnapping and sexual abuse in the November 8th abduction attempt. The victim, unnamed in the media, had identified the suspect, and during an interview, Gary had implicated himself in the crime. His composite sketch had been used during the searches for Angie and Cassidy, and at first investigators say that they cannot rule him out as a suspect in their deaths. However, Gary Stufflebean lived in Texas, many miles away from St. Louis. He had traveled to Missouri for business and family matters in early November, but he had not been in the area during Angie or Cassidy's murders. A search of Gary Stufflebean's Texas home does not turn up any additional evidence to link him to the other victims, and ultimately, Gary's employer provides him an alibi that clears him of Angie and Cassidy's deaths. And so, as 1993 turns into 1994, the two cases go unsolved. 60 days into the investigation, a local paper, the Sedalia Democrat, reports that over 1,000 leads had been looked into. Police still had not found any witnesses to either Angie or Cassidy's abduction, and are careful not to connect the cases when talking with the press. Autopsies reveal stark differences in the way the two youth died, and in February of 1994, investigators are closing in on a suspect in Cassidy's case. A U-Haul had been spotted by witnesses both in the neighborhood where Cassidy disappeared and where her body had been recovered. Rental records point police towards Thomas Brooks, a young man living with his sister at a home near to Cassidy's friend's house. A search warrant turns up bloodstains in the basement, and Brooks is arrested. He is charged and eventually convicted of first-degree murder for Cassidy's death. Despite the initial similarities between the two cases, no evidence links Thomas Brooks to Angie Housman. There is no serial offender haunting the St. Louis suburbs for young girls. Each of the cases are their own unique crimes, and there were 3 unique monsters terrorizing St. Louis instead of just one. In March, investigators traveled to Florida to investigate John Wayne Parsons. He had been caught developing provocative photography of children at a Tampa area film processing center. A search of his home turned up a newspaper clipping on Angie's death and evidence that tied him to St. Louis. "This is the best suspect we have," Robert Lowry said to the press. The St. Louis Major Case Squad obtained a court order in Florida's Manatee County to get Parsons' hair and blood samples, which were sent to the FBI for analysis. After months of waiting, however, they were found not to match evidence at the scene. And so, the quest for answers and justice for Angie's family continued. "I don't think knowing who it is will make me feel any better," said Angie's mom, Diane, who visits Angie's grave at least once a week. She was, according to her husband Ron, sinking into a depression. She'd see the street and the bus stop and bust down crying, he said. Diane keeps the curtains closed all the time, so she doesn't have to see the street. They would have liked to move, but police told them not to. "Just to keep an eye on us," Ron Bone says. But in 1999, they do finally move to Woodson Terrace, just a few miles away. The family donates many of Angie's clothes and toys at this time, but they are unable to part with her pink bicycle. "She loved that bike," Ron recalls. Ron Bone had been working as a mechanic at Sears the day Angie disappeared. His own frustrations and anger boiled over sometimes at work, and he would punch walls, he said. But it was toughest for Angie's mother, Diane. "Before she was a happy person," Diane's sister-in-law Jackie Bone told the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. "But afterwards, she was never happy. She never got over it. There was something missing in her heart." In 2016, Angie's mother, Diane, passes away from cancer. Her obituary read, 22 years after the loss of her daughter, finding out she has cancer, she still chose to fight and not give up. Diane is a true role model. Diane dies before seeing justice for her little girl. After a false confession from Corey Lynn Fox in 2001, the investigation had gone mostly quiet. But St. Louis police detectives were still working the case. Many pieces of evidence were kept. Some things had already been tested for DNA. In fact, investigators found Angie's stepfather Ron Bones' DNA on Angie's body. When confronted with this fact, Ron is unsurprised. He lived with Angie, her mother, and her little brother. It made sense that her body, her clothes, or things would have come into contact with his skin cells and genetic material. But there was other evidence that had been recovered from the woods that had not been tested. Angie's clothes in a plastic Dollar General bag were located amongst the trees not far from her body. However, some of these items had not been analyzed for DNA. Not due to an evidence backlog, not due to laziness or poor police work. The investigators were knowledgeable about DNA evidence and the current limitations of DNA extraction. They were biding their time and waiting. Testing a piece of evidence for DNA analysis often destroys the specimen. Investigators sometimes only get one chance at retrieving a DNA sample before the evidence is destroyed. Several pieces of Angie's clothing were recovered, but certain commonly used clothing dyes include inhibitors that made DNA extraction difficult. The untested evidence in Angie's case could not be tested reliably without being destroyed, possibly losing the evidence needed to identify her killer. St. Charles County Prosecutor Tim Lomar discussed this on the local news radio station KTRS.
Anytime you test a piece of evidence for DNA, what you have done is removed any sample that may be there. So future testing is rendered basically meaningless. However, our guys knew that there was new technology on the horizon, and because of that new technology, for example, the dye in her underpants, which is where we found the DNA sample. They knew that because of this new technology, that dye would no longer act as an inhibitor, so they get a true sample, and that's exactly where they found the needle in the haystack.
Finally, in 2017, after years of dedication and patience, advancements in forensic technology make DNA extraction from dyed clothes more reliable. And so investigators can finally submit pieces of Angie's clothing for analysis. A slice of the dark pink band around Angie's Barbie doll underwear tests positive for DNA. The investigators finally had the genetic profile for Angie's killer. And on March 1st, 2019, they received confirmation of a match in CODIS, a nationwide database of DNA. After years and years of hard work, searches, interviews, poring over written notes and maps, the information they needed to nab their monster had sat in an evidence box for 25 years, waiting for technology to catch up.
On one hand, it's absolutely true. Without the latest technology, there's no way we would have found the killer in this case. Now, that's not to diminish all the hard work and all the effort, blood, sweat, and tears that so many people put in over the years on this case. But yes, it was the perfect time to do this test from a technology standpoint, and that's why we found the DNA match.
At a press conference in June of 2019, a group of St. Louis area investigators gathered to proudly announce an arrest in Angie Housman's murder. "I never thought we'd solve this case," St. Charles County Prosecuting Attorney Tim Lomar said at the press conference. The DNA on Angie's underwear connects her sad and tragic death to previously convicted child predator Earl Cox. It is a match of 1 in 58 trillion. Earl Webster Cox was a native of St. Louis and had lived in a Breckenridge Hills home near to Angie's school and less than a mile from her bus stop in 1993. He had been convicted of child molestation in Germany in 1982 and had been charged with assault of a young child at a park behind Angie's elementary school in 1989, though those charges had been dropped. 4 years into Angie's investigation, the FBI had put together a large list of local sex offenders. Cox's name had been on this list, but he had never been questioned in her case. They found the needle in the haystack, and they didn't have a magnet to use, Tim Lomar said. This was about good science, good lab work, and good luck. In 2003, Earl Cox had been arrested and sentenced for administering an international child pornography network. Incarcerated in North Carolina, he was extradited to Missouri to face charges. As part of a deal to avoid the death penalty, Earl Cox confesses to Angie's killing. In 2020, he pleads guilty to first-degree murder and child molestation. Earl tells his public defender that his car broke down that fateful afternoon near Angie's home. Pulled over to the side of the road near to her bus stop, he fixed the issue with his vehicle and then saw the little girl. Angie was a stranger to Earl, the only one of his victims that he didn't already know. Cox said that he asked Angie if she was hungry, and when she said that she was, he talked her into his car and drove her to a Burger King. People who are serial child predators, they are skilled at getting cooperation from the child, Attorney Lomar said. They are skilled at making the child feel comfortable with them. After they ate, they drove around talking before he took her back to his mobile home and the assault and torture began. Earl had a living girlfriend at the time, but even she didn't know about the week Angie spent kept in the mobile home. The girlfriend worked odd hours, spoke very little English, and lived in fear of her boyfriend Earl. He was abusive, controlling, and forbade her from entering the back half of the mobile home. I think he was smart enough and conniving enough to manipulate that situation so as to not be exposed, Attorney Tim Lomar said. At first, when confessing, Cox told his lawyer that he had left Angie tied up to a tree with the hopes that she would be found. But the real-life circumstances make that unlikely. Angie had been found 50 feet from the roadway, in freezing cold temperatures without any clothes on. If Earl Cox had hoped for Angie to live, he certainly could have made that happen. He was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole. In 2021, still serving his life sentence for Angie's murder, Earl faces additional charges. Finally, more justice is being served. For the crimes taking place back in 1988 and 1989, Earl takes an Alford plea, admitting that there is enough evidence to win a conviction against him for sexual assault of a victim under the age of 14. She had been just 7 years old at the time. At the hearing, Earl makes no statement, sitting silently. But his victim addressed him directly via a video conference feed. She told him that she had spent 30 years anticipating this moment of victory. She said, "You will rot in a lonely jail cell. No family, no friends, and most importantly, no more victims."